All right, Podverse. Welcome, Pod people, to episode 3 of Office Hours with Karp and Loge, coming to you for the first time ever from our actual offices. So I'm Peter Loge. I'm an associate professor in the School of Media and Public Affairs at George Washington University and a strategic consultant. And I'm joined by my colleague,
Dave Karp, also an associate professor here at George Washington University's School of Media and Public Affairs. In my office for Office Hours with Karp and Loge, you know it's a real work day because instead of a mountain goat shirt, I'm wearing a shirt with buttons. That's how I show respect to my students.
which means he normally doesn't show respect to you, our valued listeners. Speaking of our valued listeners, we have several. We have 4 5-star reviews on Apple Podcasts.
Whoa.
Listening, yeah, right? And I don't even have Apple Podcasts, so they can't be me. So if you're listening, even if you are related to us or you feel like you want to curry favor, rate and review. A communications director at an environmental firm here, or environmental organization here in town, said she listens, learns something every week, and it's also the perfect length of a podcast to walk a dog, which I feel like is a plug for us. With a perfect length.
And I also want to note, you go half an hour. That is a listener who really loves her dog.
It is. She really does love her dog. It's a very lucky dog. I feel like it's a very lucky dog. On Twitter, we had somebody weigh in and say that on the last episode, you sounded like a Greek god. Mm-hmm. And based on the rest of the feedback, I'm guessing that doesn't mean that your temples are crumbling and you're speaking in a foreign language.
And I think I pointed out to the person that's not actually the podcast, is all of our students joint students can tell people, I'm just better than you.
That's certainly what they tell you, that they tell everybody. They
tell me that just before I grid them.
Just before, funny how that goes. It's like you provide pizza on the day that faculty evaluations are being done. The last bit of feedback. Last bit of feedback is a regular listener complained that there are too many obscure cultural references, and also once again blankety blank inflation. So good news, bad news. Good news for us, bad news for you is this means we will not be increasing our numbers of obscure cultural references.
Inflating them, if you will.
Inflating them, if you will. That's good. I see what you did there. We're gonna put links to all of those obscure references in the footnote section at peterloge.com/podcasts. And we are actually going to talk about inflation. So it's a win for us, and I mean hopefully a win for you as well, valued listeners. So Dave, you were just at the Midwest Political Science Association conference in Chicago.
Yeah, I went to my first academic conference since the pandemic. Saw a bunch of political scientists, presented some papers. Felt like I was really in the career again. It was cool.
What were your papers?
I presented a paper titled "What Happened to the Political Blogosphere." It's part of this History of the Digital Future project, looking back at the blog scholarship that I participated in back in like 2008 era, where back when the blogosphere looked like the future of digital politics, because we tend to study new technologies when they're emerging and when they're at their peak, and then we kind of move on to another thing and never look at decline. So it was trying to look at the decline and sort of talk through what happened there and recognize some systematic lessons that are probably also true for today's digital futures.
What lessons can strategic communicators or valued listeners learn from your initial finding?
I mean, the first thing is for all the focus on disruption of existing institutions, we tend to forget that, first of all, institutions are always going to respond. The blogosphere didn't end the New York Times. The New York Times just hired bloggers. And in retrospect, it's like, oh, of course they did. But that's probably true for the next wave of things that look like the disruptors. And I'd say the other thing is we tend to forget just how fragile those disruptors are. Part of what did in the blogosphere was the finances of the blogosphere rested on sidebar advertising. When sidebar advertising crumbled, so did that entire project. So follow the money whenever you can.
Makes sense. I have to say, Dave, plug for you. So every now and again, Dave teaches a course here at GW called The History of the Digital Future, which is pretty cool. He spent an entire summer reading every issue of Wired magazine from beginning to end, from start to front. And it's a prediction of the future and how those predictions fared. And as my understanding is, those predictions did not fare well.
Not great. Today, I taught that today, actually. Today, we talked about cryptocurrency, and we all agreed that it is not going to go great.
That said, if there are any crypto folks who want to sponsor us, we'll take your cash while it's still good.
But we're going to take it in cash.
We'll take the cash. We'll take your crypto in euros. Thank you very much. All right, let's get right to it. A couple of weeks ago, you predicted that the conversation in 2 weeks would shift to the economy, and we're shifting the conversation to the economy. So I feel like that prediction is coming true. Well done on you, Dave. How should Democrats be talking about inflation and the economy, and does it even matter?
So I'm glad you asked that second part. The first thing I would remind Democrats right now is that it is still April, and the things we say in April are not remembered in November. It's still in some important ways really, really early. And in that same sense, it means that the fight right now rhetorically is pretty low stakes. The substantive fight is over how the economy is going to get framed and how it will be viewed in the fall. Because there are ways that the economy is going fantastically right now. Pretty much everybody has a job. Hell, we're even starting to get unions in interesting places. Amazon, it looks like, or at least one warehouse is getting unionized. So we're having some real, like a boom times in the economy in one sense. And then also inflation is going on. And some of that was predictable, and some was predictable in advance. And some of that is also things like COVID messing with the supply chain in China, the war in Ukraine, gas prices. All of that was some things that we couldn't predict. But in that sense, the economy coming into the fall is kind of a live ball in a way that we rarely have one. That if you work the refs, and by the refs, I mean mainstream news media, and push for a focus on the elements of the economy that are legitimately going great, that can pay off over time. Because if you don't work the refs, then you can be sure that the focus is going to be on this terrible economy where everyone has a job, but milk prices went up and gas prices are high. And that can really matter. So in that sense, work the refs early and also recognize it's still early. That's my advice. What do you think?
Well, I think there are a couple of things going on. One is the messaging piece. I think you're right. You've got to work the refs, right? That's strategic communications, that's agenda setting, that's framing, that's all these basics. And I want to talk about that. I want to raise two things ahead of time. One is a question I know that you are going to absolutely love. And the other is institutional constraints, right? Sort of cutting against the premise of our program. In mid-March, Ursula Perano wrote in the Daily Beast, "Can 3 new words save Democrats from disaster?" Dave, are there any magic words?
I'm going to go ahead and say, and I don't know what 3 words she's going to say, but no.
Putin's price hike.
No, not going to do it.
Let's talk about the macro sense on magic words, and then let's talk about the framing and the specific words, because this does come down to what comms folks are doing, what my clients are wrestling with day to day. And then we can talk about some of the institutional constraints and opportunities. So magic words in general. And bear in mind, we're keeping this to a dog walk show. So
a dog walk show and R or PG-13. So I shouldn't go my entire rage. So the positive thing I would say about framing, and I start positive, is that the choice of what words and frames to use are one of the few things that we can control in a world where the stakes are very high and our control, our agency is very limited. You know, like there are things that I really wish the Democrats would have done during the past 2 years. And there are complicated assessments of what they did and didn't get done. But there's also the simple assessment of Joe Manchin was Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema was weirdly Kyrsten Sinema the whole time. And you couldn't really move a lot around those 2 boulders. Like there was a lack of agency that magic words couldn't fix on so many different policy areas. Moving into the fall, moving into the election, there's a lack of agency around things like our electoral system, the Senate map, the House gerrymanders, that just makes it tough. So I understand the idea of, well, we can control our words and words matter at least a little. So let's try to get them perfect. But then the other side of that is, you really got to hone it in, because it is not the case that if you use the right words, that'll be the thing that achieves results. You can say Putin's price hike. It's not going to get repeated on Fox News. It's not even going to get repeated fully in the New York Times. Like, you can choose whatever frame you want, and you should choose the best ones that you can, but you don't have agency to change that much.
Well, let's talk about that. Let's talk about this institutional constraints then, right? Because there's this idea that if only we use the right words, the magic words, why then everything would be puppies and rainbows. And the problem with those Republicans is they use magic words, right? And you see this after every presidential election, right? There are real institutional constraints. A number, and we know this from the political science literature. 538 put out a good piece recently that I'll throw in the footnotes section on the website, that in the 19 midterm elections between 1946 and 2018, the president's party has improved upon its share in the House popular vote just once. And since 1994, when we argue the modern political alignment to poll, the president's party has lost the national House popular vote 6 of 7 midterm elections, usually by similar margins, 6 to 9% to boot. So the midterm election is not a referendum on Joe Biden. It is not a referendum on the economy or Putin or Trump or anything else. At some level, it's math. The lower the president's approval rating, the worse the hit in the polls, right? And Biden is tanking at every measure. That's going to drag down deaths. The second institutional constraint, of course, when we're looking at the House of Representatives, which is where a lot of the attention is being focused, is, as you noted, seats are often gerrymandered within an inch of their lives, right? Elected officials increasingly choose their voters rather than voters choosing their elected officials. And this isn't new. In the mid-90s, I was talking to one congressman from a state whose party controlled the electoral map. And I said, shouldn't it be more fair if we did this more equitably or something? And his answer was, we won the right to screw them fair and square. Honestly, this is a game that we've been playing for a while. Cook, one of the most respected sort of forecasters in working professional politics, wrote that in 2022 House overview, still a GOP advantage, but redistricting looks like a wash, right? So if a Democratic seat is held by a Democrat and the Democrats are less popular, the Democrat's still likely to win, just win by less. Now, the Republican seat, the Republican's going to win by more, but the Republican's still going to win, right? You can't get more elected, right? There are a handful of seats in the middle, the Lauren Underwoods of the world, where it really matters. But by and large, there's just very little control any campaign has over any number of seats, right? So you've got those institutional constraints, plus everything that's out of the president's control. Inflation, gas prices, right? Even if Biden releases strategic petroleum reserves and there's increased production in the US, then OPEC might ratchet back its production, thereby like a net zero effect on the global petroleum supply, keeping gas prices high. There's just so much beyond the control of even the best messaging master. In that context, let's talk about what messaging can do and what messaging works. So you said Putin's price hike, not going to work.
I mean, it's no worse than other slogans I can come up with, but like, let's not pretend that the right slogan is going to save much.
All right, let's try another one. The Biden boom.
I hear the Democrats saying that a lot when I hear Nancy Pelosi talk. The fact that you're only hearing it when Nancy Pelosi is talking is a problem, because that means that it's a slogan that is not getting amplified through the media apparatus. I mean, if you want to have a bigger impact here, you need to invest in, over the long term, more mainstream and more partisan media that can help get your message out. There's no real Democratic equivalent to Fox News. That puts Democrats at a disadvantage. So you can use that slogan, but where's it going to echo to and who's it going to reach?
Well, you've got comms people. I'm advising these folks that I know people come to you for advice, looking for like answers to the fall. Like, we're heading into the fall. I know it's only, it's early. What do we say to candidates? What do we say to down ballot candidates? How should we be framing this? Like, yeah, we got to build infrastructure. We got to build. November is like too soon to build a media empire. So what do we say between now? What do Democratic strategists say between now and November about the economy and inflation?
So I would say that the administration should do whatever they can to keep on juicing the economy and see what they can do to tamp down on inflation. Though again, they're a little limited there, and those two goals can be at cross purposes. Some of the things that economists say you can do to tamp down on inflation are also meant to tamp down on the economic recovery. And so that's a choice there. I would focus on trying to have elements of the economy that are clearly a good story, communicate that story, but try to have the reality on the ground be good. And then what I would tell candidates right now is worry less about your slogans and more about your organization. Right? Like build the type of field organization right now that can go to reach voters, since you don't have the media operation that it would be nice if you could counter with.
I think that makes sense. I think you hit on a really important point, and that's the word story,
Mhm.
right? I think it's easy for think tankers and folks like us to forget that people don't experience the economy. I
Mhm.
don't experience the economy. Like I buy gas, right?
Mhm.
I buy, I took a Lyft the other night to meet some friends for dinner, and there was a gas surcharge,
Mhm.
right? Oh my gosh, gas is right. So it's part of it is doing what we can to minimize those bumps. But at some point also telling individual stories, individual success stories in the economy, right? So if
Mhm.
I've got a job and I'm lucky enough that I have one, and if I'm relatively healthy and safe and all that kind of stuff, if I'm feeling bad about the economy, it might be my perceptions about how other people are feeling. If you can counter
Mhm.
with a story, let me tell you a good news story. Here's somebody who 2 years ago didn't have a job or was worried about health care. The expansion of the Affordable Care Act, closing some loopholes, fixing some glitches means such and so finally has health care for the first time ever. As you said, we are now unionizing, real wages are rising. People have access to things. There's competition for jobs. If you feel like you've got a miserable job, you no longer have to hang on because it's the only job you can find. You've actually got choices. And tell an individual story of a family, ideally where you are, where your candidate is running, things are getting better, right? So if you're a
Mhm.
candidate, you can say, look, I know things are kind of a mess you pick your state's least favorite state, but right here in River City, cultural reference number one, right here in River City, things are actually getting better. Let me tell you the story of such and so who opened a restaurant and was able to because of the Affordable Care Act, so employees could get benefits on, or opened a small manufacturing business because manufacturing is coming home right here in. And here in our economy, our state, our district, our neighborhood, things are actually really getting better. That way you sort of disentangle from the global political news, which is basically all bad at this point. Does that make sense?
On one level, that makes sense. The other thing I'd put out there, though, is I think that fits well in a speech. The other level you want to be playing on is thinking about what's the media agenda really going to be occupied by? And that's where I think there's still a lot of questions moving into the fall. Well, one thing that's going to change between now and the fall is it's going to become less about Joe Biden and the Democrats versus generic Republican or generic opposition. And it's going to be against specific opponents. And those specific opponents are going to be the type of people who most effectively kiss Donald Trump's ring. And that's where I think the other question for the Democrats is, what do they do both with the Trump corruption news? I mean, there's this news this past week that Donald Trump Jr. Was texting Mark Meadows on November 5th with his plans for how they could overturn the election.
And Mark Meadows was the chief of staff.
Mark Meadows was the chief of staff, right? So the plot to overturn the election didn't spontaneously occur on January 6th. It was planned in advance by the Trump team, including members of the Trump family, starting as votes were still getting counted. There's also news this week that apparently the January 6th committee now feels that they have enough to recommend that the DOJ go after Trump with criminal charges, but they're unsure as to whether or not they should recommend it because they're worried about making it all look political. Those are real questions. Those are real challenges that they have to face about how is that going to move forward? Because we could have a fall that is dominated with stories about the Trump family corruption and the entire Republican Party saying, you know what, there was really nothing wrong with a little bit of treason and a little bit of incitement. We also may have a fall, depending on what the Supreme Court does this summer, that's dominated with how the country deals with the aftermath of the end of Roe v. Wade. that may still be happening. I think it's probably more likely than not that they strike down Roe. So those are going to be other issues that demand attention in a way that stories about how much are we paying at the pump, or stories about how now people have more economic mobility, while they're good stories that fit into a speech, I think attention is going to get drawn towards these other parts of politics that really matter, because corruption really matters, and a woman's right to choice matters, but are put off to the side by the general economy questions. So the difficulty is, how do the Democrats shape what politics is about? Because it's not necessarily going to be even people aren't necessarily going to be centered on the economy or inflation.
Yeah, I think part of that's true, and I think part of it maybe isn't, right? And there's a third variable on the throne, which is you talk about a lot, and that's the pandemic. At
Right.
some level, like if the pandemic recedes and we're all more or less fine in October, when people begin to make up their minds, things look better for Biden. Here at GW, the mask mandate was optional for a heady 7 days, and now it's back because
I just started to see what my students' chins. My students had chins.
We had one magical week of knowing what my students look like. So that's also out of their control. But there's some other pieces as well. And I keep coming back to John Hidding, and I'm going to keep throwing him in the chat or in the footnotes. Most people, most of the time, view politics mostly like a toilet. They just want it to work. And they view political disagreement as a failure of democratic politics, right? And so I think corruption matters. Of course, Roe matters. Of course, undermining democratic norms matters. And I think the national news is going to talk about that and have to talk about that. I think a lot of voters are going to look at that and go, that's Washington noise, that's Washington noise. Do you have any idea how much it cost me to fill my tank of gas? So I think if there's a national noise machine that says corruption, democratic backsliding, protecting a woman's right to choose, protecting access to health and healthcare, protecting the environment, and then individual candidates can then come in and say, you know what, nationally, it's a mess and there's a lot to deal with. Right here we are focusing on our local economy, and in Congress, we are working to deliver dollars from infrastructure to finally rebuild our roads. We can finally rebuild our economy. So I think as a candidate, you can tell the local story. And it's not just a speech, right? You get somebody in a video, you get infographics, you get screenshots, you get door-to-door canvassing, you get maybe some deep canvassing if you have the time, as long as there's this background noise of like, wow, Republicans are a hot mess, we're undermining democracy. But we're good here because our candidate has our best interest in mind. Does that make sense?
It makes sense. And yeah, the broader challenge here is we have one party that is associated with let's try to make government work, and another party, and this dates back to the old Reagan line about nothing scarier than somebody who shows up saying, I'm from the government, I'm here to help. That has now gone on for long enough and spiraled down long enough that we have the Republican Party basically does not want government to help provide answers. And it's easier to break stuff than it is to build stuff. So there's a sense in the country that's largely correct that it doesn't seem like government works very well. I think the needle that is hard to thread is Democrats can't just ignore the noise machine. I mean, I don't know what the racist attacks are going to be, but I'm sure it's been since 2010 and before that there's always been some, in 2018, it was the caravan, which we magically stopped caring about as soon as the election was over. In 2010, it was the Ground Zero Mosque, which was not a mosque and was not at Ground Zero. But let's try to scare people across the country into voting with Muslims in mind. So that is going to be going on. It's probably going to be some advance on critical race theory and some mix of the don't say gay stuff or the abortion stuff is going to be animating Republicans to say, let's go on the cultural offensive. If Democrats ignore that and just say, we want to talk about how government's going to work for you, we're going to help make the economy work, particularly if things like COVID are going poorly because they don't control mutations in a virus. That ends up being really difficult because it leaves voters saying, God, they're saying government is going to work, but everything's a mess. Maybe I give the other side another chance. I think if instead you're reminding people of what a calamity, not all, like just 2 years ago, we were in the midst of, then hopefully you remind people you really don't want to hand the keys back to the Trumpists because you remember what an awful shit show that was.
No, I think that's right. I think that's right. And it's going to be CRT. It's going to be justice. Jackson, let's get a shout out for that. We predicted that. It wasn't like a huge,
wasn't a hard prediction.
Wasn't a hard prediction, nevertheless.
We could count up to 50.
Right. More or less. Yeah. Yeah. That really, yeah. At any rate, so there's going to be some of that. There's going to be anti-trans hate. There's going to be a lot of the book banning. There's going to be a lot of that noise. And I think Democrats have to respond to it, and they have to respond to it smartly and wisely. But I can also think you can, without saying, look, we're from the government, we're here to help, you can say, herein, things are getting better. Mm-hmm. Like, we are going back to work, right? In our community, in our neighborhood, in our city, right? Because one of the things that this increased partisan divide has done is nationalize races, right? And the demise of local media, our former colleague Nikki Usher writes about this really eloquently. One of the problems of demise of local media is there's no local political coverage. So all of politics is national. So you're no longer talking about the stop sign at the end of the block. You're no longer talking about the local elementary school. You're talking about, oh my God, those crazy people somewhere else. Mm-hmm. So if Democrats can say, we could go back to corruption, waking up every morning thinking, oh my gosh, what's going on? We can go back to everybody who's under indictment. We can go back to crazy town, or we can keep working here locally on bringing jobs back because jobs are coming back. We can work on expanding access to affordable quality healthcare because we're expanding that access. You're not talking about government. You're talking about us as a community coming together to do these things. You tell individual stories. Here's a mom, here's a family, here's a kid, right? And there's somebody to whom I can relate because they're from my neighborhood. They have my accent. They use, whatever local colloquialisms we use, that kind of a thing.
I mean, you can do all that. I still think, I'm a pessimist on all this. I think we're pretty late in the game with nowhere near the firepower resource that we need. On the broader scale, if American democracy is going to recover, it's going to require the Republican Party fixing the Republican Party. And that only happens if there ends up being a cost and a downside to Trumpism. So I think this isn't really a suggestion for an individual candidate or campaign, because look at your map and do what you can. But I would say on the broader scale, it's important to create a cost for Trumpism by not allowing them to memory hole or move past the deep corruption and the attempt to overthrow the government that happened really not so long ago. I mean, this isn't like deep history we're dwelling on. This is the past administration and most likely nominee next time, and probably the kingmaker this time. If you give Republican candidates a free pass to go full Trumpist in order to win their primaries and motivate their base, but also never talk about just how bad and how toxic all of that was, then instead what you're left with is a Republican base that is whipped up into a frenzy, and everybody else saying, yeah, I didn't really love those past few years, but these past 2 years haven't been great either, because objectively they haven't been. We don't control COVID, and there's just a lot that's outside of the administration's ability to control or ability to govern. One of the parties won't come together to govern with them. So I think you need to create a cost to Trumpism, and that means even when it's uncomfortable, focusing on the not so long ago absurd circus of corruption and wrongdoing.
I think that's right. Elected officials and candidates behave their incentives like the rest of us do. And we tend to be risk averse. And we tend to be more concerned about losses than we are interested in gain. All of this from Conor Tversky, who I'll now throw in the footnote section, and all of this from other research as well. And also as an elected official, as we said earlier, you can't get more or less elected, right? If you do something and you win with 60% of the vote, you don't care if you get 63 or 57, right? So you're unlikely to do things that you think might disrupt whatever it is you got there. And you're probably wrong about what got you there. You probably are overestimating your insight and brilliance as a candidate and undervaluing things like it was a midterm and you were part of the president's opposition party, right? So I think we've got to create those incentives. And I think that if enough Trumpies lose, and even like hardcore conservatives who don't have Trump's blessing win, suddenly they think, oh my gosh, the difference was Trump. maybe we should abandon that and put on, I don't know, fleece sweater vests or whatever it was Youngkin wore in his 2021 race.
I wrote a bit about this for my Substack a little while ago. There's a self promo. I have a Substack. If you want to see that sort of change, it actually, I'm pretty sure, doesn't happen after just one election cycle. You need probably 3 consecutive cycles where the belief within the party network is they did a lot worse than expected. So the easy example here is the Democrats. It takes until 2006 of the Democrats, like 1998, they held serve. 2000, they lose when they think they should win. 2002 is bad. 2004 is bad. After that series of elections, you then see within the party a sense of, we've really got to change who's running things because we don't win this way. The Substack post was pointing out that really the shock that we had was probably 2010, because 2006 was terrible for Republicans. 2008 is terrible for Republicans. If they had, Democrats weren't going to win in 2010. They had just insane numbers of seats in both houses. But if they had stemmed the losses, if there had been fewer losses, and Republicans left 2010 feeling like, even in these circumstances, we're just not making a lot of headway, I'm pretty sure that basically would have been the end of the Tea Party revolution within that party. And that's when they probably would have said, we've got to try a different thing. And instead, the big win in 2010 meant that they called 2012 like not a real thing. And they kept going down that cycle. Tea Partyism sets up Trumpism because it's just a theater of the absurd that's going deeper and deeper. And so like what you need is stem the losses this time, but then you need probably 24 or so to go well too, before the Republicans start actually saying we need to move beyond Trumpism because we don't win this way. It takes a lot of time before that actually sinks in.
I think with that last thought, I think it's fantastic before we get into the final wrap-up section, because this is one tired dog. And that is one of the things we've talked about at the beginning, and what common people often talk about is defining the terms of your success. Like, why vote for us? I want the debate on my terms. The other thing we can do that I hear you saying is define the terms of the opposition's failure. Look, here's why you lost. I cannot believe you guys keep following Donald Trump. That's so obvious, right? Regardless of whether or not it's true, you sort of define it, because it's a lot of reasons, right? I mean, the Democrats were told guns is why they kept losing seats for a long time, and everybody was afraid to talk about gun control, right? And it was, 2010, oh my gosh, I told you everybody hated Obamacare, as opposed to, no, Dems had a lot of seats that were really Republican seats. But if you can say, hey, I can't believe you people keep chasing the wrong train, right? Then, as well as reframing the debate in a way that helps you, maybe you also help frame for that. So food for thought for 2 weeks from now. In the meantime, Dave, we're not going to do predictions because we're so good, at least this week. U.S. qualified for the World Cup after a really boring and not very good loss against Costa Rica. Check. Justice Jackson, check. Talked about the economy. We've been doing that for half an hour. I feel like we're on a roll. So instead, let's talk about things that are going to go wrong. Dave, what's going to go wrong next?
What's going to go wrong?
What's going to go wrong? I've got a doomsday scenario. So I'm setting you up because I'm basically going to beat yours. Not that there's.
Okay. I want to hear your doomsday scenario because I will definitely outdo it, whatever it is. Let's hear Peter Loge trying to go dark with Dave Karp in front of him. You take a shot at being the doom and gloom guy. Go for it.
I say you want it darker, which is a Leonard Cohen reference. So I feel like all this big talk of mine about we're going to get more obscure cultural references. There's 30 minutes of actually grown-up stalking. Very confusing. Doomsday, according to the New York Times. Those of you listening to the pod missed the flailing that made it really, really impressive.
Podcasting, it's a visual medium.
peterlodge.com/podcast. You watch it on YouTube and check.
What's your doomsday? Let's hear it.
I'm scrolling to it. I'm buying time here. According to the New York Times, shards of asteroid that killed dinosaurs may have been found in a fossil site in North Dakota 66 million years ago. An asteroid crashes into the Earth, creates massive destruction, wipes out the dinosaurs. Some archaeologists have found, encased in amber, apparently air and dust and spores from that moment, which is to say, we have encased in amber, which we're going to release 66 million year old space air, whatever that is, that they're going to release into the world. It killed the dinosaurs. It's going to kick our ass. I've seen this movie. It does not end well.
So
What
what
do
I'm
you got?
hearing here is I have long believed that anyone who lived through the 2016 election has to be at least a little superstitious, because you cannot look at how that election turned out and not think to yourself, okay, somebody jinxed it. It sounds like these are scientists who are not superstitious enough. Do not release that asteroid spore gas. I'm with you there. I'm with you.
And I have to say, though, this does feed into your overarching hypothesis or view for how we're going to solve global climate change. We're simply
Just
not
not last that long.
we're going to die first. And I'm quoting Dr. De Palma, a graduate student at University of Manchester in England, said all these dirty little nuggets. These are little dirty nuggets. I want to get that right order. They're little dirty nuggets.
Yeesh.
Thanks for tuning in, folks.
There we go. There we go. Good. Check back with us in 2 weeks where we'll find out whether or not the dinosaur asteroid spores ended us all. This reminds me of my strategy for dealing with the zombie apocalypse if it ever comes. You know what I'm going to do?
What are you going to do?
Get bitten early.
Good night, everybody.